Okay, so consent to limited representation. This comes up quite a bit. I do work for a large brokerage where there are multiple people that work under the same broker. So in the state of Arizona, we have one broker, a designated broker that oversees our paperwork. Typically, they have a team of people that are also reviewing documents and the paperwork as well, but one person that's essentially overseeing the transaction. So in this case, if we ever run into a situation where we have two agents from the same brokerage, or I'm actually overseeing both sides of the transaction, so I'm representing the buyer and I'm representing the seller, then this document would be used. So the buyer's name goes here, seller's name goes here, property's name goes here, brokerage name goes here. So depending on the situation, whether it's one person, so if I'm overseeing both sides, this box would be checked. If I'm overseeing one side, whether I'm representing the buyer, if I'm representing the buyer, my name goes here. If I'm representing the seller, my name goes here. So there's certain limitations in terms of how I can represent you when we have one broker that's overseeing both sides of the transaction. At this point, they're obviously receiving both my documentation, they're receiving the documentation from another agent. So they're seeing both sides of the transaction because they're getting the documentation from both of us. So the duties and limitations, the broker now represents both the buyer and the seller, and both parties understand that neither the broker nor broker's licensees, that would be me, if I'm doing both sides, myself and the other agent, if we're each representing one side of the deal, can represent interests of one party to the exclusion of or detriment to the other party. The parties understand that further consent to the following. This is where when I'm representing you, there's another agent representing you, that or the one side, but we both have the same broker, there are certain things that are limited in what we can and cannot do. The licensee or licensee represents both the buyer and the seller with limitations of the duties owed to the buyer and the seller, such as the licensees will not, without written authorization, discuss to the other party that the seller will accept a price or terms other than stated in the listing, or that the buyer will accept price and terms other than offered. So if I'm representing both sides of the deal, and I have a seller that says, well, we've listed for $499, $500,000, but we would probably take $480 if the terms were right. I cannot go and tell the buyer that my seller has said that. So it doesn't matter whether or not I'm representing both sides or not, or I can't tell the other agent that, nor would I, but I can't say to the other side, hey, they'll come down to 480. Like if the number is, if the property is listed for 500, then that's what we're trying to get for the property. But if I'm representing both sides, and let's say that the buyer says, well, I want to offer 475. I can't say, well, I know that they won't take that, but they might take 480. Maybe you should try that. I can't even say that. All I can say is, okay, we'll write it up at 475. We'll see what they say. Then if I know that the buyer would say, well, I really want to try to get it for 475, but I'd probably pay 490 for it, I'm not going to go back to the seller and say, well, he said 475, but I think I can get him up to 490. I'm not going to say that either. I'm just going to say to the seller, what do you want to counter at with this purchase price? So in those cases, it's like, I'm not going to give you a whole bunch of information. I can't disclose what both parties have said. I can just guide you through and say, okay, well, your options are to counter, disregard the message, or reject the offer altogether, or you can counter them back at a price that you feel comfortable with. So guide you through the same way, but just I can't disclose what one party has said to me versus the other party. So number two, there will be conflicts of duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure of confidentiality. Disclosure of confidential information may be made only with written authorization. This does not relieve each licensee of any legal obligation to disclose all known facts which material and adversely affect the consideration to be paid by any party of the transaction. So basically, in this case, if I know that there are defects with the property, if I'm listing the property, I'm representing the seller in the sale of a home, and I know that there are certain defects in the property, obviously the seller is supposed to disclose those, but if the seller does not disclose them, it is still incumbent on me, knowing that there are defects with the property, that need to be pointed out to the buyer and disclosed to the buyer. So where the seller property disclosure statement comes in and where all of that information is disclosed, if I notice that something that they have told me is not on there that I know could adversely affect the sale of the home, then the SPUDs has to be updated, but then I also am obligated to disclose that to the other side. So that's not a confidentiality thing. That is actually, that wouldn't matter whether there were myself and an agent from another brokerage on either side of the deal. There are still things that I'm required to disclose regardless. Number 3, pursuant to ARS 322156, sellers, lessors, and brokers licensees are not obligated to disclose that the subject property has been, 1, the site of a death, suicide, homicide, any crime classified as a felony, owned or occupied by a person exposed to HIV or diagnosed with having AIDS or any disease not known to be transmitted through common occupancy of real estate, and then located in the vicinity of a sex offender. So that's true regardless. It doesn't matter whether I'm representing the buyer, seller, or whatever. That is incumbent on the buyer to do their own due diligence on the property in terms of what matters to them or not. So if being in the vicinity of a sex offender matters to the buyer, then that's important for the buyer to do their own due diligence. We've never been required to disclose anything regarding the property being the site of a death, homicide, suicide, anybody with HIV or AIDS living in the property or being exposed to HIV or AIDS. The property was where there was a crime classified as a felony. That's all incumbent on the buyer in order to do their own due diligence and that's on multiple documents that the buyer signs. So this isn't brand new information. This isn't specific to this particular document. This is just reiterating very firmly the verbiage in other documents that the buyer would sign. Licensees shall exercise reasonable skill and care in performance of their duties. Obviously, that's something I would do anyway. Licensees shall be obligated at all times to deal honestly with all parties. That's true as well. I just cannot violate confidentiality. I cannot disclose terms without both sides saying that they're comfortable with me disclosing the terms. So if seller says to me, we're listed for 500, we'd be willing to take 480 under the right circumstances. Buyer says to me, I'm willing to come in at 490. Like, I really want it for 475, but I'd be willing to do it at 490. Then unless I have it in writing from you saying you can tell the seller that I said this, I cannot disclose that. Any prior agreements, so the compensation to the broker shall be paid pursuant to the separate agreements. So there's a listing agreement that hires me to sell the home. There's a buyer broker agreement that covers any commissions that the seller is not willing to pay based on the rate that I charge. Prior agreements, so I would get paid for doing either side. If I'm doing both sides, I'm still going to get paid for each side of the deal that I'm doing because I'm still working and earning the commission for both sides of the deal. There's a lot of work that goes into both sides of these, and both agreements outline how I get paid. Prior agreements, seller and buyer understand this consent does not replace any prior agreements entered into with broker, and such agreements shall remain intact, remain in effect. However, to the extent that the terms of this consent contradict or conflict with the terms of prior agreements, this consent shall supersede. So if we have some sort of agreement where it doesn't line up with this particular agreement, this agreement is going to supersede any other agreement that we have in place. Termination: if the seller and buyer do not enter into a contract relating to the subject property, or if the transaction between the seller and buyer fails to close, the parties agree that this consent is terminated. The parties shall have no further rights or obligations pursuant to this consent. So if we get halfway through the deal, we get through inspection period, but the property doesn't appraise for whatever reason, we're not able to come to terms on a new purchase price, and the deal falls apart, then the consent to limited representation goes away. And then I go back to working with the buyer, trying to help them find another property. And then I go back to working with the seller to try to find them another buyer. And if we get to a point again where we're in a situation where it's another agent from the same brokerage as myself, then a new document would have to be signed based on the subject property. So this is specific to one property and one address. An indemnification: seller and buyer agree to indemnify and hold broker harmless against any and all claims, damages, losses, expenses, or liabilities, including attorney's fees and costs incurred by broker in any defense thereof arising from the broker's role of limited representation. So you're basically just signing and acknowledging that there are certain things that unfortunately I cannot negotiate to the best of my ability, because my hands are tied in certain ways where I can't disclose information that if I got it from another agent, I would be able to pass it along. But specifically, if I'm representing both sides of the deal and I'm representing both the buyer and the seller, there's not as much, my hands are tied a little bit more than if I'm just representing you and one side of the deal.